At 78 years old, Theodore Harrison was thrown out of his $1 million estate by his own blood, left with nothing but a worthless deed to a dilapidated $500 hunting shack. But his greedy heirs made one fatal mistake. They had no idea what was buried beneath the floorboards. Theodore Harrison sat in the leather wingback chair of his sprawling Litchfield, Connecticut estate, listening to the grandfather clock tick away the final moments of his life as he knew it. At 78 years old, Theodore was a retired architect, a man who had spent his entire career building sturdy, beautiful foundations for others. He had designed the very house he was sitting in, a magnificent 6,000-square-foot property with manicured lawns, a cedar-paneled library, and a wraparound porch where he and his late wife, Clara, had spent 40 golden years. Clara had passed away 3 years prior, leaving a void, snorts in Theodore's heart, that the echoing halls of the estate could never quite fill. They had never been blessed with children, but Clara had a sister, and that sister had 2 children, Bradley and Cynthia Hastings. Bradley was a 42-year-old hedge fund manager who wore bespoke Italian suits and looked at the world as if it were a spreadsheet waiting to be liquidated. Cynthia, 2 years his junior, was a socialite whose primary occupation seemed to be calculating the net worth of everyone in her contact list. Theodore had never liked them, but he had tolerated them for Clara's sake. He never imagined they would be the architects of his ruin. Clears throat. The knock on the heavy oak front door came precisely at 9 a.m. Theodore didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. When he opened the door, Bradley and Cynthia stood on the porch flanked by Jonathan Croft, a ruthless estate attorney known in Connecticut's upper crust for tearing ironclad wills to shreds. "Good morning, Uncle Theo," Bradley said. His voice was smooth, devoid of any genuine warmth. He stepped into the foyer without waiting for an invitation, wiping his expensive loafers on the Persian rug. Cynthia followed, her eyes immediately darting toward the antique silver tea set resting on the dining room table. "You have no right to be here, Bradley," Theodore said, his voice trembling with a mixture of age and suppressed rage. "The appeal hasn't even been processed." "Actually, Theodore, it has?" Attorney Croft interjected, withdrawing a crisp manila folder from his leather briefcase. He handed a stack of legal documents to the elderly man. "The appellate judge dismissed your motion yesterday afternoon. The ruling stands. The property, the liquid assets, and the antique collections belong entirely to the Hastings Trust." The betrayal had begun a year ago, uncovered through a devastating legal loophole. The Litchfield estate had been built on land originally owned by Clara's grandfather. When Clara passed, Theodore assumed the life estate they had drawn up would protect him until his dying day. But Croft had dug into the archives and found a technicality, an archaic clause in the grandfather's original 1940s trust, dictating that if Clara died without direct descendants, the land and any improvements upon it reverted immediately to the bloodline heirs. The life estate Theodore and Clara had filed in 1985 had been improperly witnessed by a notary whose license had expired 2 days prior to the signing because of a bureaucratic error from nearly 40 years ago. Theodore was legally a squatter in his own home. "It's just business, Uncle Theo," Cynthia said, offering a practiced, sympathetic pout that didn't reach her cold eyes. "You have to understand the property taxes alone are astronomical. We've already found a buyer, a developer, who wants to subdivide the acreage. We really need you out by tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Theodore leaned heavily against the mahogany banister. "I'm 78 years old. Where am I supposed to go?" "My pension was tied into the investments you froze." Bradley adjusted his silk tie. "We've generously arranged for a moving truck to take your personal clothing and a few sentimental items. Anything else? The furniture, the art, the silver is part of the estate. As for where you'll go, I believe you still have that piece of junk land in Maine your father bought. The state hasn't seized it for taxes yet, miraculously." Theodore's mind raced. He remembered the deed. His eccentric father, Henry Harrison, had purchased a tiny plot of land in Penobscot County, Maine back in 1974 for a mere $500. It was entirely off the grid, boasting nothing but a rotting hunting shack. Theodore hadn't thought about it in decades. He only kept paying the $15 annual property tax out of sheer habit. "You're throwing me into the woods," Theodore whispered, the harsh reality finally settling in his bones. "After everything Clara and I did for you." "We're simply executing the law, Theodore," Croft said smoothly. 48 hours later, Theodore stood on the sidewalk with 2 worn suitcases and a battered leather briefcase. He watched as a private security guard locked the wrought iron gates of his home. His life's work, his memories, his entire sense of security stolen by greedy heirs, hiding behind a legal technicality. Clutching the worn deed to the $500 main property, Theodore hailed a cab to the bus station. He had $400 in his checking account, a fractured heart, and a burning resolve to simply survive. He didn't know it yet, but the Hastings siblings, in their rush to strip him of his wealth, had just handed him the map to a fortune that dwarfed the Litchfield estate. The bus ride to Bangor, Maine was a grueling 14-hour ordeal that left Theodore's arthritic joints screaming in agony. From Bangor, he spent nearly a quarter of his remaining cash on a local transport van that drove him 2 hours deep into the sprawling, dense pine forests of Penobscot County. The paved roads gave way to gravel, and the gravel eventually gave way to a muddy, overgrown logging trail. "This is as far as I go, buddy," the driver said, casting a skeptical look at the elderly man and his 2 suitcases. "I'm sure you're going to be all right out here. Nearest neighbor is 5 miles down the ridge." "I'll be fine," Theodore lied, his voice tight. "Thank you." As the van's taillights disappeared into the tree line, Theodore turned to face his new home. Calling it a shack was a generous compliment. It was a 400-square-foot wooden box that looked as though a strong gust of wind would flatten it. The corrugated metal roof was rusted completely brown, half the windows were shattered, and the front porch had collapsed in on itself. The surrounding brush had grown so high it practically swallowed the structure whole. Theodore unlocked the flimsy front door. The padlock was practically rusted shut, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, animal droppings, and damp pine. A rusted cast-iron wood stove sat in the center of the room. There was a metal cot with no mattress, a rickety table, and a solitary wooden chair. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He set his bags down, rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt, and got to work. The first 3 weeks were a brutal test of endurance. Theodore used his meager remaining funds to hitch a ride to a local hardware store, buying a cheap axe, thick plastic sheeting for the windows, cleaning supplies, and non-perishable food. He learned how to chop kindling, a task that left his hands blistered and bleeding. He fetched water from a nearby creek, boiling it on the wood stove. At night, he slept on a cheap foam pad, wrapped in 3 layers of blankets, listening to the coyotes howl in the distance. He often thought of Bradley and Cynthia, undoubtedly sipping champagne in a luxury condo funded by his stolen estate. The anger kept him warm when the fire died down. The turning point came during Theodore's 4th week. It was mid-October, and a vicious nor'easter swept through the region. For 2 days, freezing rain battered the shack horizontally, and winds howled like a wounded animal. The old shack groaned under the pressure. Theodore huddled near the stove, praying the roof would hold. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm broke, leaving the forest dripping and eerily silent. Theodore stood up to brew some instant coffee. He walked toward the heavy cast-iron stove to add a log. Crack! The sound was sharp like a rifle shot. Before Theodore could react, the rotted pine floorboards beneath his left foot completely gave way. He pitched forward, crying out in pain as his leg plunged straight through the floor, scraping against jagged splinters. He caught himself on the edge of the stove, panting heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Damn it!" he hissed slowly, pulling his bruised and bloodied leg out of the hole. He sat on the floor, inspecting the damage. A 3FT section of the floor had completely collapsed into the crawl space below. Grabbing his heavy-duty flashlight, Theodore leaned over the jagged hole to see how badly the joists were damaged. He clicked the flashlight on and aimed it into the darkness beneath the shack. He expected to see dirt, cobwebs, and perhaps the rotting foundation beams. Instead, the beam of light reflected off something dull and metallic. Theodore frowned, wiping his glasses and squinting. Directly beneath the floorboard, set flawlessly into a thick slab of poured concrete, was a massive circular steel hatch. It looked entirely out of place, like a submarine door buried in the mud of the Maine woods. Theodore's exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of pure adrenaline. Clears throat. He grabbed his crowbar and frantically began prying up the surrounding floorboards, ignoring the pain in his hands and knees. The dry, rotted wood splintered and tore away easily. After 30 minutes of grueling labor, a 5x5 FT section of the floor was clear. Theodore stared in absolute disbelief. The hatch was roughly 3 FT in diameter, forged from heavy dark steel. In the center of the hatch was a large, rusted iron wheel, and bolted below the wheel was a brass manufacturer's plate. Theodore wiped away decades of grime with his thumb and read the engraving, Diebold Safe and Lock Company, Canton, Ohio. Custom installation, 1974. 1974. The exact year his eccentric, secretive father had purchased this worthless $500 plot of land. "What on earth were you hiding, Dad?" Theodore whispered to the empty room. His father, Henry Harrison, had been a brilliant but paranoid man. He had made a fortune in importing and exporting during the mid-20th century, but he had grown deeply distrustful of banks and the government in his later years. Theodore had always assumed his father's wealth had been lost in bad investments before his death. Theodore grabbed a can of WD-40 he had bought for the door hinges and emptied half of it onto the central locking mechanism of the wheel. He waited 10 agonizing minutes, grabbed a heavy piece of firewood, and wedged it between the spokes of the iron wheel for leverage. With a guttural shout, pushing with all the strength his 78-year-old frame could muster, he heaved against the wood. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a high-pitched metallic shriek that echoed through the small cabin, the wheel broke free. Theodore spun it counterclockwise. Clack, clack, clack. Heavy steel locking pins disengaged from the concrete housing. He grabbed the heavy iron handle, planted his feet, and pulled upward. The hatch hissed, breaking a vacuum seal that had held for nearly 50 years. A rush of stale, shockingly cold, bone-dry air hit Theodore's face. He aimed his flashlight down into the abyss. Instead of a dirt hole, the light illuminated a set of pristine, reinforced concrete stairs leading down into the pitch black. Taking a deep breath, Theodore gripped the flashlight carefully, lowered himself onto the first step, and began to descend into the earth. The air inside the staircase was shockingly dry, carrying the faint metallic scent of ozone and oiled steel. Theodore's flashlight beam cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating 20 perfectly poured concrete steps leading down into the earth. With each cautious step, his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The pain in his injured leg dulled, eclipsed by a potent mixture of fear and awe. At the bottom of the stairs, Theodore stepped onto a heavy rubber mat. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the subterranean room. It was a reinforced concrete bunker, roughly 20 FT wide and 30 FT long. The walls were lined with industrial steel shelving, and a massive dehumidifier system, long dead, sat in the corner, connected to a passive geothermal vent that had miraculously kept the chamber free of moisture for nearly 50 years. In the center of the room sat a heavy oak desk, and stacked methodically on the steel shelves were dozens of olive-green wooden crates. Theodore limped toward the nearest shelf. The crates were secured with heavy iron latches. His hands shook as he set the flashlight down on the desk, grabbed a rusty flathead screwdriver from a nearby workbench, and wedged it under the latch of the first crate. With a sharp snap, the lock gave way. He lifted the heavy wooden lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of waxed canvas and surrounded by desiccants, were rows of perfectly stacked, gleaming yellow bricks. Theodore reached out, his breath catching in his throat, and lifted one. It was astonishingly heavy, weighing just over 32 troy ounces. Stamped into the face of the metal were the unmistakable hallmarks of the Credit Suisse Bank. It was a solid kilo of 999 fine gold. "My God," Theodore whispered, the sound swallowed by the thick concrete walls. He opened a second crate. More gold, a third, a fourth. There were 30 crates in total, but the wealth didn't stop there. On the opposite wall sat rows of heavy canvas bags. Theodore untied the thick hemp rope of one bag and poured a handful of its contents onto the desk. A cascade of heavy golden coins clattered against the wood. He picked one up and examined it under the harsh beam of the flashlight, an 1892 American double eagle. There were thousands of them, numismatic treasures that had been pulled from circulation decades before he was even born. His eccentric father hadn't lost his fortune in bad investments. Henry Harrison, terrified by the United States completely abandoning the gold standard in 1971 and deeply paranoid about corporate collapse, had quietly liquidated his vast shipping empire. He had converted his life's work into untraceable physical wealth, burying it beneath a worthless shack at the edge of the world. At current market prices, Theodore was standing in the middle of a vault worth upwards of $40 million, but it was what he found on the oak desk that truly changed the trajectory of his life. Resting in the center of the blotter was a thick, fireproof lockbox. The key was taped to the top. Theodore unlocked it and lifted the lid. Inside rested a stack of pristine notarized documents and a single handwritten letter sealed in an ivory envelope. Theodore recognized his father's sharp, cursive handwriting immediately. He tore it open and read the words that would become his salvation address: Theodore. If you are reading this, the world has likely gone to hell, or I have finally passed on, and you had the good sense to hold on to this land. I never trusted the banks, Theo. I never trusted the paper money they print out of thin air, and I certainly never trusted the men in suits who smile while they pick your pocket. Everything I built is in this room. The gold is yours, but the true power is in the black folder beneath this letter. During the liquidation of my assets, I purchased controlling anonymous bearer shares in a holding entity called Vanguard Archival Trust. It holds the master deeds, covenants, and original land grants for half of Litchfield County, including the grandfather clauses that supersede any modern trust. Do not let anyone take what is yours. Use this to protect yourself. Build your legacy and crush anyone who tries to tear you down. With love, your father, Henry. Theodore set the letter down. Tears, hot and heavy, finally spilled over his cheeks. He wasn't crying out of sadness. He was crying out of sheer, overwhelming vindication. He opened the black folder. Inside were the yellowed, perfectly preserved master trust documents from 1948. His father had quietly bought out the holding company that owned the original Hastings land grants. The very same 1940s trust clause that Bradley and Cynthia had used to evict Theodore was completely null and void. The land didn't revert to the Hastings bloodline. It reverted to the Vanguard Archival Trust, which Theodore now owned outright. A dangerous, icy smile spread across Theodore's weathered face. He looked around the vault, surrounded by more wealth than Bradley Hastings could ever dream of managing. "You wanted to play with the law, Bradley," Theodore whispered to the empty room. "Let's play." The counteroffensive began 3 days later. Theodore packed a small leather satchel with 20 of the pristine double eagle coins and hiked 5 elmi through the mud to the nearest paved road. He hitched a ride to Bangor, where he boarded a flight to Boston. He walked into Osgood and Sons Numismatics, a high-end rare coin dealer in the financial district. The appraiser nearly fainted when Theodore laid the flawless 19th-century gold coins on the velvet counter. Within an hour, Theodore walked out with a cashier's check for $450,000, a mere drop in the bucket of his new fortune, but more than enough to fund a war. His next stop was the glass-paneled corner office of Nathaniel Reed, one of the most ruthless and brilliant corporate litigators on the eastern seaboard. Reed was a shark who charged $200 an hour, and he was worth every penny. Theodore slid the cashier's check across Reed's mahogany desk, followed by the black folder containing the Vanguard Archival Trust documents. "I need you to execute a hostile takeover," Theodore said, his voice hard and steady, "and I need it done with absolute, devastating precision. I don't just want my house back, Mr. Reed. I want the people who stole it to lose everything." Reed opened the folder, his eyes scanning the archaic legal text. Slowly, a predatory grin formed on the lawyer's face. "Mr. Harrison, you don't just own their house. According to these covenants, you own the land beneath their corporate offices in Hartford. You are their landlord, their master title holder, and their worst nightmare. How would you like to proceed?" "Silently," Theodore replied, "until the trap snaps shut." For the next 4 weeks, Theodore lived in a luxury suite at the Ritz-Carlton, coordinating the destruction of the Hastings Empire. He dispatched armored transport teams to Maine, moving the gold from the shack to a high-security subterranean depository in Manhattan. Meanwhile, Reed went to work. Bradley Hastings was highly leveraged. His hedge fund relied on a veneer of invincibility. Reed, using Theodore's limitless capital and the Vanguard Shell Company, quietly bought up the debt of Bradley's primary investors, calling in margin loans and freezing his operational liquidity. At the same time, Cynthia Hastings was busy celebrating. She and Bradley had officially finalized the sale of the Litchfield estate to Oakmont developers for $8.5 million. The bulldozers were scheduled to arrive on Monday to begin tearing down Theodore's meticulously designed home. They had no idea that Theodore had purchased Oakmont developers entirely in cash 3 days prior. The climax arrived on a crisp Friday morning. Bradley and Cynthia were standing in the grand foyer of the Litchfield estate, sipping mimosas and waiting for the final wire transfer to hit their accounts. Attorney Jonathan Croft stood nearby, smugly reviewing the closing paperwork. The sound of crunching gravel drew their attention to the front window. A sleek black Maybach pulled through the wrought iron gates, followed by a dark SUV. Bradley frowned, setting his champagne flute down. "Are the developers early?" The doors of the Maybach opened. Out stepped Nathaniel Reed, carrying a sleek titanium briefcase, and behind him, dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, walking with a silver-tipped cane, was Theodore Harrison. Cynthia gasped, nearly dropping her glass. Bradley's face flushed with immediate anger. "What the hell is this?" Bradley barked, marching out onto the wraparound porch. "You are trespassing, Theodore. Croft, call the police immediately." Theodore didn't flinch. He walked up the steps, his posture straight, his eyes burning with an intensity that stopped Bradley in his tracks. "I wouldn't make that call, Jonathan," Reed said smoothly, stepping forward. He clicked his briefcase open and produced a thick stack of legal filings. "Unless you want to explain to the authorities why your clients are attempting to sell a property they do not own." "That's absurd," Croft scoffed, stepping forward. "The appellate court ruled." "The appellate court ruled on incomplete evidence," Reed interrupted, handing Croft a manila envelope. "Enclosed is the verified authenticated master deed from the Vanguard Archival Trust, dated 1948, which supersedes the localized family trust you relied upon. Furthermore, as of Tuesday, my client, Mr. Harrison, is the sole owner and acting CEO of Oakmont Developers. The sale is cancelled." Croft pulled the documents from the envelope. As his eyes darted across the pages, the color completely drained from his face. His hands began to shake. This alters the entire chain of title." "Bradley, he's right. The Vanguard clause nullifies your grandfather's trust. You never had the legal right to claim this estate." "What are you talking about?" Cynthia shrieked. "He's an old man with nothing. He lives in a shack in Maine." "That shack," Theodore said, his voice echoing like thunder across the porch, "was built over a bunker containing $40 million in untraceable assets. Assets my father left me, assets you foolishly pushed me into finding." Bradley stumbled backward, clutching the banister as if the world was spinning out of control. $40 million! It gets worse for you, Bradley." Theodore continued, stepping directly into his nephew's personal space. "Did you wonder why your primary lenders called in your funds debt yesterday? Why Apex Capital froze your credit lines? I bought them. I bought your debt. Your hedge fund is insolvent as of 9 a.m. this morning. You are bankrupt." Bradley's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable financier was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified man. Clear's throat. "You threw me out of the home I built for your aunt," Theodore said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You gave me 48 hours to pack my life into 2 suitcases. I am far more generous." Theodore pulled a silver pocket watch from his vest, checking the time. "You have 20 minutes. Take the clothes on your backs. Everything else inside this house belongs to me." "Uncle Theo, please," Cynthia sobbed, dropping to her knees on the porch. "We're family." "Clara was my family," Theodore said coldly. "You are simply a bad investment I have just liquidated." 20 minutes later, Bradley and Cynthia Hastings walked down the long driveway on foot, leaving behind their luxury cars, their designer clothes, and their stolen wealth. Attorney Croft had already fled in a panic, desperately trying to figure out how to save his own law license. Theodore stood on the porch watching them disappear down the road. He took a deep breath of the crisp Connecticut air, smelling the cedar trees and the blooming hydrangeas. The house was quiet again. He walked inside, closing the heavy oak door behind him. He poured himself a glass of Clara's favorite scotch, sat in his leather wingback chair, and listened to the grandfather clock tick. He was no longer just a retired architect. He was a king who had reclaimed his castle, built on a foundation stronger than concrete, a foundation of absolute justice. Theodore didn't just get his revenge, he got his entire life back. He spent his remaining years turning the Hastings Bankrupt Fund into a massive charity for the elderly, ensuring no one would ever be thrown out on the street like he was. What would you have done with the $40 million vault? Let us know in the comments below. If you love this story of ultimate karma, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life dramas.